Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the OBS Pod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter anyone else that's interested, the OBS Pod is for you. Episode 182, Big Baby Update. One of my most popular episodes of all time was episode 29, Big Baby. I can't help but think that this is because it's such a common problem that women encounter during their pregnancy, or that midwives encounter when they're delivering antenatal care. I'm not going to repeat everything that I said in episode 29. So if you haven't listened to episode 29, go back and take a listen, because that's a really good place to start. Although I recorded it nearly 5 years ago, much of what I had to say then is still absolutely relevant. So if I'm telling you to go back and listen to that episode, why am I recording a new one? What has changed? Well, the thing that's prompting me to record today is the publication of the Big Baby trial. This was a trial undertaken by Warwick University, and its results were eagerly anticipated by many of us in the maternity world. We had this issue, as I described in episode 29, what to do when a woman came to see us with a scan that suggested the baby might be big. The baby might be in the top 10% of the population, or 90th centile or above. And the reason we have concern that we should be doing anything is because of our worry about complications at birth, in particular shoulder dystocia, which I covered in episode 102. That's where the baby's shoulder gets wedged behind the woman's pubic bone after the birth of the head. This can lead to complications for the baby, and it can lead to more severe tears for the mum. So definitely a good thing to avoid, and definitely has an association with bigger babies, although that isn't the only factor that influences whether you may or may not have a shoulder dystocia. At this point, I feel it's fair to emphasise that many women and babies that will have a shoulder dystocia will not actually have any complications at all. Shoulder dystocia is defined as needing to do additional manoeuvres to release the baby's shoulder. Normally, during a vaginal birth, straightforward one, the baby's head is born by extension, and then the baby rotates, something we call restitution and external rotation. So that's the baby's body coming down the birth canal and under the pubic bone. And there's often a minute or two between the birth of the head and that occurring. And we as care providers need to wait patiently and not try and help the baby be born until those things have happened. We need to wait for that normal mechanism. And sometimes that means waiting for a whole nother contraction, which can feel like a really long time and can be quite disconcerting as a junior member of the maternity team. Shoulder dystocia is defined as needing to do additional things. So rather than just being able to place our hands on the baby's head and help with the birth of that baby, if needed, we need to do some additional manoeuvres. And you can go and listen to episode 102 to find out a bit more about what those manoeuvres are. So let's turn to the big baby trial. So the big baby trial was looking at if your baby was estimated as being big on an ultrasound scan, that is over the 90th centile, so in the top 10% of where we'd expect baby's growth to be, and the heaviest 10%, if we offered an intervention, that is an early induction of labour, so starting the labour off artificially before the woman is ready to go into spontaneous labour, whether or not that would make a difference to the chance of shoulder dystocia happening. The idea is that you cut short the baby's ability to grow even bigger, so the baby has a slightly lower birth weight because it's born a little bit earlier, and therefore you might avoid the possible complication of shoulder dystocia. So that was the plan. They aimed to look at around 4,000 women. So they were going to compare 2,000 in one arm, so the intervention arm, so that is offering an earlier induction. And in this case, they were talking about induction between 38 weeks and 38 and 4. So 38 weeks, 4 days. They were going to compare this with standardised care. So if you were having standard care, that just meant you were having whatever the midwives and obstetricians were normally doing. Well, certainly in my unit, there's quite a lot of variation about what people are doing. Do we offer caesarean? Do we offer induction? If we offer induction or caesarean, at what point? How many weeks? So standard care, yes, that is standard for what that hospital were doing. So that's a kind of control arm. But standard care suggests everyone's having the same care. And when I come on to look at the results, that really is not the case. And in the study, they were assuming a rate of shoulder dystocia of around 4%, or 1 in 25 births in that cohort of bigger babies. So that's the plan. Let's turn and look at what actually happened. And I'm not going to go into every minute detail. I'm going to put a link to the study in the show notes. The first thing that I noticed in the write-up is that they stopped the trial early. And the reason for stopping the trial early is that the levels of shoulder dystocia were lower than they'd anticipated. So they didn't think they were going to be able to pick up a difference in levels of shoulder dystocia between the investigation arm, that's the earlier induction, and the standard care arm. So straight away, the issues were that the complication of shoulder dystocia in those estimated bigger babies was lower than expected. The next thing that you need to look at is the timing of birth. So they were aiming for a difference of timing of birth of 10.5 days on average between the two groups. And they hoped that this would result in a birth weight difference of around 300 grams. When you look at the results, they ended up with only an average of 6 days difference So much closer differences in gestation at birth, and only 163 grams difference in birth weight. And I think this is partly because of this issue about standard care that I mentioned earlier. When you look at those having standard care, only around a quarter of women actually went into spontaneous labour beyond 38 weeks and 4 days. So around 70% of women ended up with some form of induction or caesarean anyway, as part of standard care. Around a quarter were induced between 38 and 5 and 39 weeks, so a couple of days later than the induced group. Around a third were induced between 39 plus 1 and 39 plus 6 weeks. And to me, what I really want to know is not about whether I should be suggesting induction at 38 to 38 plus 4 or 39 to 39 plus 4. I want to know, should I be recommending induction at all? Should I be intervening at all? What would happen if these women went into spontaneous labour? Because we know some of them will go at 38, 39, and some of them will go at 40 or 41. So I think one of the major problems with the trial for me is standard care. What is standard care? And standard care is in itself an intervention, it would seem. Because only 261 women in the standard care arm went into spontaneous labour after 38 plus 4. So only a quarter of women actually went into labour after that date when their body and their baby were actually ready. And that goes back to what I talked about in episode 29. How many hundreds or possibly thousands of women and babies need to have an induction to prevent potentially one case of shoulder dystocia. One of the other things that interests me about this trial was how you define shoulder dystocia. And shoulder dystocia is a clinical diagnosis. Did the care providers need to do some additional manoeuvres to help with the birth of the baby and the baby's shoulders? Now at work we have a very clear pro forma to fill up with what manoeuvres and interventions are we doing to release the baby's shoulders, and how long was the delay from the birth of the head to the birth of the baby's shoulders and body. So I had a look at the results, looking at the time between the delivery of the head, the birth of the head, and the birth of the body in minutes. And I found this really quite astonishing, because the mean time between the birth of the head and the birth of the body in minutes for the induction, the intervention arm, is 1.09 minutes. And with standard care was 1.21 minutes. Now, I don't want to be too negative, but so to me, these times are unbelievably quick. And I appreciate that that's because there were very, very few cases of shoulder dystocia. But a minute between the birth of the head and the birth of the shoulders in both arms is incredibly fast and doesn't suggest that we're waiting for the normal physiological mechanisms of birth even. If you wait for another contraction, it's usually a good maybe 2, sometimes even 3 minutes before the birth of the rest of the baby. And whilst this might seem unimportant because they had very few shoulder dystocias in the study, it is important because if you take your hands round the baby's head and perform traction, which is the routine next step potentially with a vaginal birth, if you do that too early before the baby has come into the right position, restituted, the head is restituted and external rotation has occurred, then you could mislabel and call something a shoulder dystocia that wasn't. So luckily, because there were so few shoulders of dystocias, we don't have to think too much about what we're defining as a shoulder dystocia, but it calls into question for me some of the midwifery and obstetric practice. And this was a large multi-centre trial in the UK, so don't get me wrong, I'm not criticising any particular unit. I'm just saying maybe our skills at assisting a physiological birth and our education around the normal mechanism of birth needs a little bit of freshening up. Okay, now for the really big question. Were these babies actually big? Were these babies actually above the 90th centile? In episode 29, I talked quite a lot about the margin of error with ultrasound scan in the 3rd trimester, in the last third of pregnancy. So, what did the big baby trial find? Well, for me, this is the single most important finding of the trial. So remember, we said that these were babies that were on the top 90th centile. Approximately 60% in both groups, so the induction group, the intervention, and the standard group, the babies were not above the 90th centile. i.e., they weren't as big as we thought they were. So 40%, in 40% of cases, yes. So if you're told you've got a big baby above the 90th centile, there's a 40%, 4 in 10 chance that that is correct, and a 60% or 6 in 10 chance that the baby is smaller. And that's massive, because that means we're doing all this intervention to prevent a complication that not only is rare in those bigger babies, but also your baby might not be big at all in the first place. And whether we're doing the intervention described in the big baby trial of induction between 38 weeks and 38 weeks and 4 days, or whether we're doing standard care, which appears to be a lot of induction before 40 weeks, why aren't we just leaving things alone? I can't help but feel we've kind of tied ourselves in knots. We don't know what to advise. To me, the big baby trial hasn't really helped me give some really good information, quality information to women about their chances. And we're doing an awful lot of intervention. And don't get me wrong, if your baby has a bad shoulder dystocia and has a complication as a result, that is awful. And if you have a bad tear as a result, that is equally can be very difficult and prolonged recovery with consequences for you. But the chance of that happening is really small. And yet we're building this fear about the size of a bigger baby. And we're doing a lot of intervention just in case and not thinking about the potential complications of that intervention further down the line. And to be fair to the big baby trial, they did look at things like maternal postpartum hemorrhage and bad tears. So they did try and look at this, but that's still very short-term outcome of a few months. They're not looking at what was the outcome longer term for these mothers and babies beyond the first few months of motherhood and of life. Finally, before I leave this topic, I'm going to talk about the results of intention to treat and per protocol, because this is a slightly weird way they decided to analyse the results. So intention to treat is, we intended to do this to this group. This group, we intended to have standardised care, and this group, we intended to have induction, and that's how we're going to analyse the results. And in that way, intention to treat, there wasn't a difference in shoulder dystocia between the two groups. Then they looked at what they called per protocol outcomes, which meant that anyone that had had a baby before 38 plus 4, induction or going into spontaneous labour, they looked at those babies and those mothers in comparison with the others. And for that, they said there was a small difference in shoulder dystocia between the two groups. But to me, it's kind of moving the goalposts, because when I'm talking to a woman in clinic, I can only advise her on what maybe I'm recommending in terms of treatment. I can't in advance know when she might or might not go into spontaneous labour and say to her, well, if you go into spontaneous labour or you're induced for another reason before that, then it will make a difference. But if I intend to induce you and you agree to that induction, it won't make a difference. I mean, how useful is that? Maybe it's because I'm not an academic and scientist, I'm a jobbing obstetrician. But to me, that's really unhelpful. And when they put out the big baby trial, that's why you will see in some of the headlines and some of the reports the fact that they suggested that this reduced the chance of shoulder dystocia. So I'm going to put a little health warning on that per protocol analysis rather than intention to treat analysis. To me, with my kind of common sense jobbing brain, it kind of doesn't make sense. Okay, now for the zesty bit. If you're a pregnant woman, my zesty bit would be take any third trimester or late pregnancy growth scan result with a pinch of salt. In this study, the scans were done for other reasons. So the scans, just by coincidence, found that the baby was big. And you might end up in that situation too. But bear in mind that figure, that statistic, that actually 6 out of 10 babies that were thought to be the 90th centile weren't. And also, having a baby on the 90th centile, don't think that that means you're automatically going to have a scary and difficult birth. Yes, you may have discussions with the obstetrician and midwife, you may have choices to make, but try and hold that thought and ground yourself with that thought. If you're working in maternity, then I think we need to also take the whole big baby study with a pinch of salt. Has it added to our knowledge? I'm not really sure it has. And that's a shame. Why is it that the research we're trying to do on this occasion has really not helped push things forward? Or to look at it a different way, maybe it has. Maybe it's telling us that we should not be inducing and intervening and worrying about the size of a baby when the baby's on the bigger side. Maybe that is what the conclusion is, but it's difficult when perhaps the hypothesis, the theory we had in mind, is not proved by the research we then undertake. So I hope that's been helpful. Those are my thoughts about the big baby trial. And do go back and listen to episode 29, my original big baby episode, and in particular the wonderful poem at the end, which gives you the viewpoint from Jenny Thirlwell, my good friend Jill's daughter, about what it was like in her pregnancy with this yo-yoing between too big, too small, just right. How it feels to have endless scans giving different answers. I very much hope you found this episode of the OBS Pod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the OBS Pod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at the OBS Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can email me theobspod@gmail.com. Finally, it's very important to me to keep the OBS Pod free and accessible to as many people as possible, but it does cost me a very small amount to keep it going and keep it live on the internet. So if you've enjoyed my episodes and by chance you do have a tiny bit to spare, you can now contribute to keep the podcast going and keep it free via my link to buy me a coffee. Don't feel under any obligation, but if you'd like to contribute, you now can. Thank you for listening.